Hello again, this is Earl Silverman, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Rheumatology, welcoming you to my interview with the authors of an important and interesting article, which will appear in the December 2025 edition of the Journal of Rheumatology. Today, I will be speaking with Dr. Yonah Ziemba and Dr. James Crawford from the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine, Northwell Health, New Hyde Park, USA, and they're speaking on behalf of all the authors of our featured article titled COVID-19 Vaccine Booster Uptake and Effectiveness Among Persons with Systemic Autoimmune and Rheumatic Diseases. So I want to thank you both for taking the time to speak to me and our listeners on behalf of the authors and to discuss the findings of the important paper, as unfortunately, COVID-19 infections are still a concern of patients with autoimmune rheumatic and other systemic autoimmune diseases, and particularly for patients on immunosuppressive agents. So without further ado, we'll start. So I think it might be a good place to start if you can review the recommendations for the vaccination during the study period of your study, including a comment on if the use of immunosuppressive agents altered the recommendations.
Thank you. I will take this question number one, and I'll make a comment right from the very start. I'm sure everyone who is listening is using the acronym SARDs, Systemic Autoimmune Rheumatic Diseases. I'm a strong believer in peer review, and one of the reviewers said, well, actually, not every condition that you included is strictly a systemic autoimmune disease. So the title I put systemic autoimmune and rheumatic diseases, in case you were wondering where that came from. But throughout the manuscript, I used the acronym SARDs in the final proofing process. In looking, especially in preparation for this question, going back through both the historic recommendations as well as current recommendations, I think there's very strong alignment internationally on what constitute both historically and current recommendations for immunization of patients with these immune diseases. And the basic idea is whether you're age 65 and older like me, or have a immune compromising condition, either intrinsic or acquired, that you should at the very least have a full initial vaccine series, and that for patients with immunocompromised conditions especially, you should have additional doses, what we would call booster doses. It's been very interesting to see the evolution of the booster doses, and that's highly relevant to the time frame of this study. Yonah can go through the choice of the two windows, but those windows were aligned with the first booster vaccine, what was the monovalent booster vaccine being approved by the Committee on Immune Disorders for the CDC and also internationally. And then the bivalent vaccine came along, so that we basically upped suit for the second time frame. I think the most critical pivot point was the recommendation in September of 2020. Boy, I lose track of the years now. September 22. That booster vaccines should be given, and the rollout of those vaccines aligned with our study period too, as Yonah will further explain. The real question that I was, as a member of the United States Serologic Sciences Network community, was listening to intently was, what's the relationship of vaccination to the timing of immune suppressing therapy? And this was a question both for oncologists as well as for rheumatologists who were in the innumerable virtual meetings that have been going on ever since the start of the pandemic. And from a clinical practice standpoint, the response I would hear, and I would say even more strongly from oncologists than rheumatologists, is we are going to give the treatment for the patient's cancer, regardless of the status of the patient's vaccination. In the case of rheumatology, I'm not a rheumatologist, I'm a pathologist, but my sense of the choice of timing for autoimmune and rheumatic diseases is that there is more option for the timing of giving the immune suppressive therapy. And so both extant as well as current recommendations, again, across 3 countries, the British Society of Immunology, in Canada, which I just checked this morning, again,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
the United States, and yes, there is still a web page with recommendations for COVID vaccines in the United States. I actually was expecting there not to be, but it is there. Is that if possible, the vaccine should be given at least 2 weeks, the completion of the primary series or the administration of a booster vaccine should be given 2 weeks before start of the immune suppressive therapy. Conversely, if immune suppressive therapy has been given, that there be a window for time for the patient's immune system to, I would say, partially recover. You do want the immunosuppression, but whether that window is 2 months or 3 months sort of aligns with the spacing between the primary series recommendation was what I've been able to see. In our own studies subsequent to the submission of this manuscript, one could posit that some immune suppressive therapies for autoimmune and rheumatic diseases have a more lasting effect on the immune system than others. But I think that's going to take future studies to really sort out what the true holiday might be. Bottom line, current recommendation, be up to date on your primary series at the very least, and if at all possible, have a booster vaccination before initiation of immune therapy. But if that's not possible, give the vaccination anyway. And the last comment is the CDC at least does not recommend doing serologic studies to assess immune status.
That was very helpful.
That recommendation still stands.
Good. Well, that certainly informed our audience, and nice to hear there still are recommendations at the CDC and in the US.
Less than an hour ago, I checked, and they are still there.
Okay. So away from politics, now we'll move back to your study. And if you can just outline the population, the time period, and what vaccinations patients received.
Yonah, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for having us. Really appreciate the opportunity to help teach what we were able to research. So one of the big strengths of the study was the size and, importantly, the diversity of the population. So our data was contributed from 4 large United States health systems. So Northwell Health is in the Northeast. The Veterans Health Administration is spread out throughout the United States. Kaiser Permanente was from Northern California, and Cedars-Sinai was from Southern California. The clinical criteria were systemic autoimmune or rheumatologic diseases. These were identified using ICD codes. Plus, they had to be under active treatment. This active treatment, number one, confirmed that the diagnosis was that the diagnosis was still active. It also added the element of we want to study patients who are on the treatment because the treatment as well as the disease could be contributing. We required several other requirements. They had to have sufficient health system engagement. We wanted to avoid a situation where we were saying that the patient was negative for something simply because we hadn't engaged with the patient enough to learn that. Most of our health systems determined engagement by the number of visits. Kaiser Permanente had a unique mechanism since they are also function to replace an insurance company. They determined eligibility based on the user enrollment. And so that was the population. Moving on to the study period. So our study was very much based on the vaccines, how the vaccines were developed. Throughout 2021, the vaccines that were available were monovalent. And then in January 1st, 2022, there was a rollout. I'm sorry, September 1, there was the rollout of the bivalent boosters. This also correlated with different strains of the vaccine in the population, as well as different vaccines. So I think it was really interesting in that we were able to capture that. Now, in order to qualify, which vaccines did we look at? We wanted vaccines that were authorized based on the United States FDA. This was the United States population, and everything went by the FDA guidelines. The primary series was defined as Pfizer, Moderna, and Janssen. And each of those were defined based on the guidelines for those. So the guidelines for Janssen is a little bit different than Moderna and Pfizer. Moderna and Pfizer have more subtle differences. And for each one, it was based on those guidelines. So for example, if a two-dose series had one Moderna and one Pfizer, that patient was excluded because that wasn't exactly the guideline. For the monovalent boosters, it was any monovalent product, Pfizer, Moderna, or Janssen. It had to be 28 days after completion of the primary series, consistent with the FDA's, with the CDC, I'm sorry, the CDC recommendation. For the second time period, we looked at bivalent boosters. These were available from Pfizer and Moderna. The patient was eligible if they were received from September 1 through August 31 of 2023. And the patients were also excluded if they ever had non-US authorized products. So not only it didn't qualify them, we felt that those patients should be excluded because we don't really have a way to measure the effect of the non-authorized vaccines.
I have a quick question just for my own validation. You could have received the Janssen or J&J vaccine, and obviously the booster was then one of the mRNA vaccines. Is that correct? And they were eligible.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you have to. It's two. I'm thinking of it as two criteria. You have to
Sure.
have a qualifying primary and then a booster.
Right.
The two don't have to match because according to guidelines, they did not have to match.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Jim, you want to add anything to
Well,
that?
to go right back to the title of the publication, and this is a study of booster, both uptake as well as efficacy.
Mhm. Right. Okay. So
Not the primary series.
right. I understand.
And for all of us who went through, I mean, we all did go through the COVID pandemic.
Right.
You know, we're chasing after the pandemic. In other words, to do studies is to be chasing after a moving target. And so to be able to do observational study on the booster vaccines that were available at the time required a lot of deliberation to make sure that our exclusion criteria were rigorous and reproducible.
Absolutely. And I was impressed that it was. So.
One more thing I'd like to say. I mentioned the NCI, National Cancer Institute funded Serological Sciences Network, short was Seronet. This was a study emanating from Seronet. These four institutions were member institutions of Seronet, and this was one of two major, three major observational studies coming out of it. The first being cancer, this being autoimmune, and the third being transplantation.
Thank you. So now the punchline. What did you find?
Okay, so I think that is the most fascinating part of our paper. So boosters very substantially and significantly decreased severe COVID. The protection against any infection was limited. So to expand on that, severe COVID was hospitalization or ICU admission. Our data is strongest in hospitalization, partly because we have the largest data set, and there was a very significant reduction in the hospitalization rate when patient received the boosters. The ICU outcome also showed a very big reduction in the point estimate. The confidence intervals are longer because we did have a smaller patient population, and that definitely limits the certainty that we could ascertain. In terms of comparing the autoimmune patients to their non-autoimmune, I think that what we see is that the benefit was so big in autoimmune because their baseline is bigger. It's always easier to make a big effect if the baseline is bigger, and that's really what we were able to see over here. You alluded to, did the disease type or the therapy type make a meaningful modification? And I think that's a very complex and interesting question. So in short, I think the most accurate answer is that we didn't see a modification. There was no clinically significant, or even statistically significant difference on either the disease or the drug. In terms of how to interpret that, I do think that experts are going to agree that it has to matter, that, different diseases are going to make a difference and different therapies are going to make a difference. I could say that the difference is not big enough that in our study and in our data, we were able to see it. I think that's one thing we could say. And I would also add that these things are very sensitive to your study design. Our study design was set up to compare with a booster and without a booster. We were not set up to compare this disease versus that disease. And that's also going to limit the statistical significance of what we can see in the output.
I understand. I just want to emphasize, because it's taken me a while to get my head around the comparative groups, that it is patients who receive the booster to patients, not the general population, who received one dose, but not necessarily. In the first study, let's say one dose, but not the booster. The second part, the initial primary immunization, but not the booster. Is that correct? Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes. Yeah. So this is definitely something worth clarifying. The bivalent booster was coming after patients were expected to have the primary series. Because of that, we compared patients who had the bivalent versus the patients who didn't have the bivalent. However, we were concerned that it might make a difference. Of course, it could make a difference as to what their baseline status was. And for that reason, we put it into the Cox proportional hazard ratio to correct for that. We didn't exclude a patient who did not have the primary, but we accounted for it to correct for that. In the primary series, we really wanted to focus on patients who had the primary series and it was yes booster or no booster. And in the primary series, we actively excluded patients rather than the correction factor.
You want to add anything, Crawford?
Yeah, going back to Yonah's comment about the baseline, strictly on the basis of hazard ratio, which is a way of declaring efficacy, whether in the general population, which was the comparison population, or this autoimmune and rheumatic disease population, the hazard ratio, change was the same. Basically not statistically different. But the impact was dramatically different because when you look at the number of patients needed to vaccinate to prevent a hospitalization, it was much, much lower in the immune-compromised population, the SARDs population, measured in single hundreds, whereas you were in the high thousands or above for preventing a hospitalization, the number of persons needed to vaccinate. And so if you're going to say, to use a British term, how many people should we jab? The efficacy of a jab in a autoimmune or rheumatic patient is much higher because they already have a propensity for admission. And when you actually look at the raw numbers during our study period, a patient who had COVID and had one of these autoimmune or rheumatic conditions had a 1 in 10 chance of being admitted to hospital. So, reducing hospitalization is the name of the game. Once in hospital, the fraction, the number of persons who were admitted to ICU is again the same between general population and the immune compromised. So the fundamental goal that our booster vaccinations demonstrate efficacy was reduction of hospitalization, and templated against the publicity, quite honestly, at the time this article was published electronically, was vaccines are ineffective because they don't prevent infection. That's not the point. Vaccines are effective because they greatly reduce the risk of hospitalization.
I'm sold on that one. I mean, I think hopefully we've come around that. I mean, in most, I get digressing. I get the flu vaccine because I don't want to be admitted to the hospital.
Yeah.
That's the reason I might get
That's
flu.
the reason.
I won't,
and that's the reason I got my booster COVID vaccine last Monday.
Me too. That's over 65 people. So there you go. So you alluded to this a little bit earlier. How does your study, putting in context of what's out there in the field, how does it compare, contrast, add, whatever you wish to expand?
I'll go back, especially with you, Dr. Silverman, as the editor-in-chief of the journal, as our moderator. I'm also editor of a journal, and my belief in peer review, an article submitted undergoing peer review is better, or if it does ultimately pass the peer review process. It was a reviewer who asked this question and said, do something about it. So that it was my task to create Table 4, which is to basically go through the world's literature on booster vaccinations to the best of my ability, with my co-authors looking over my shoulder, to make sure that I scoured the literature and caught every one. Since the paper was published electronically, I found one more, but it's the same. The primary series for the initial strains of the vaccine, highly effective. Primary, the monovalent boosters that initially came out and were just catching the tail end of Alpha and Delta, also highly effective. By the time we got into this study period, we'd entered into Omicron. And Omicron pretty much dominated the scene through these two time periods. And our study showed, reduction of some 30% risk, hazard ratio 1.4 for hospitalization if you weren't vaccinated. If you hadn't received a booster, but only the primary series. And against the world's literature from both internationally, this being Denmark, Israel, as well as initial studies coming out of the Americas, a booster vaccination was more effective against Delta. But a booster vaccination against Omicron, our study aligned nicely, both with studies that were smaller but more focused and, yes, prospective, but also with meta-analysis of the many collective studies that were smaller coming out. And it was simultaneous with us doing our study that the second publication came out from Israel looking at third dosed booster during the Omicron period. And our study showed not quite as effective reduction in risk of hospitalization in this immunocompromised population. But both the Israel study and the first author is Bieber, and our study, first author Ziemba, aligned very nicely with the conclusions of this study. And for anybody who wants to see it, it's Table 4 in this publication.
Ziemba, you want to add anything? Don't feel obliged.
Oh no, I just I very deeply agree with what Dr. Crawford said about peer review. It's something that I think makes the paper so much stronger, and we're grateful to you as editor-in-chief for putting it through this process and asking us to do this.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's nice to know sometimes you pick good reviewers who can add to a paper and not just try to put people down. So it's nice to hear. Okay, well, on those self-congratulatory note, we'll move on to the final question that I have. And for this year, this might be an easy one. Who should be vaccinated? Like, because I know there is controversy, at least from the government's recommendations. It's not, certainly in my country, it's not that clear to me.
Well, I'll speak first as a person, but also as a co-author on this paper. I concur with the need to be informed about vaccinations, which is the sentiment of our times. That being said, for me in grade school, knowing the parents of my classmates who had debilitating polio, up to and including iron lung, and are literally lining up around the block to get the first Salk vaccine. These memories are very deep, and the importance of vaccination in our society. We've all gone through a searing experience through the course of the COVID pandemic, and I am very glad that we were able to publish this work in the Journal of Rheumatology that provides real-world evidence in support of what I'm about to say, which is our study is real-world evidence in support of current recommendations that patients who have systemic autoimmune and rheumatic diseases should not only have their primary series completed, but should also have booster vaccination. And that the goal of that vaccination is not to prevent breakthrough infection, it's to reduce the risk of hospitalization and the attendant risk of admission to ICU if you are hospitalized.
I think that's very important. As a pediatrician, you're preaching the converted about vaccination. And as a clinician, it's good to have this evidence and be honest with your patients about, are you going to get infection? Maybe. And maybe this won't prevent it, but your chance of getting hospitalized are much lower. I think that's very important data. So I want to thank you. So on that note, are there anything you'd like to add that maybe we missed?
I would just like to reflect on that to many vaccines. I know that we often hear in the general public about does the vaccine work, and there's often anecdotal knowledge of somebody who had the vaccine and got the infection. And just as a member of the general public, what we really do care about is severe disease. Having an infection that doesn't really affect you is a data point, and having severe disease could be life-changing. And I very much think that one of the very important findings of our study is that it doesn't necessarily correlate. You can have a vaccine that won't prevent every infection, but it will make it much less severe. And it's something that, for me personally, it changed it was a paradigm shift in how I think we should evaluate the value of vaccines.
And severe disease is defined as needing hospitalization.
Right.
It's not going into an ICU and needing respiratory support. It's hospitalization in the first place.
I agree with you completely, and hopefully the message will get out there. And just as I was listening, I would love to see a study, because the other people think certainly people are worried about is long COVID. I'd love to see a study of, does vaccination and booster, does that affect long COVID, which we're coming back to life altering, what alters people's life, long COVID, even if they're not in the hospital. So.
Right. That's not this study, but I definitely hope
I would
you have
love
opportunity
to see you guys do that one.
Okay, I appreciate the invitation. We do have access to data that hopefully will help us make progress in that area.
I hope so, and we'd love to publish it. So I want to thank you both for taking the time and for a very interesting and informative interview about your paper. And I encourage everybody listening to not only read the paper titled COVID-19 Vaccine Booster Uptake and Effectiveness, among persons with systemic autoimmune and rheumatic diseases, but also there's an accompanying editorial which titled Ongoing Benefits of SARS-CoV-2 Vaccination and Booster Vaccination 5 Years Following the Start of the Pandemic by Doctors Som and Patel from Mass General Hospital, Harvard Medical School, Boston, USA. And I think the titles of these tell us what we should do. And so both of these are available at our website at jroom.org and will appear in the upcoming print, in the December print edition of the journal. And I want to thank you for joining in and hope you all will come back next month. So when you will hear a very interesting informed article and hopefully as informative discussion as we had today from the article on the January 2026 edition of the Journal of Rheumatology. And if there are any comments or questions, please, you can send them to X on X at jroom, or by email manuscripts@jroom.org. And again, I want to thank you both for a very informative, at least for me, and I'm sure our audience, discussion, and was an excellent paper. Thank you.